Hey, welcome back to Night Owl Movie Talk, keeping you up on the latest movie news. And by latest, I mean roughly the last 125 years of horror. Um, I thought maybe this episode we would kind of like just embrace all that is the beauty of horror, so I'll spend a little bit of time talking about why we love horror, why it's great, what's, so wonderful about it, what makes it what it is. And then I thought we would move on to kind of like a big, we'll move up to like 40,000 feet and we'll take a look at the history of horror, but we'll look more at the forest, not so much at the individual trees. We'll point out a few big trees along the way, but, mostly we just kind of want to get an idea of how things evolved the way they did and what happened when. And then we'll kind of wrap everything up by going into horror subgenres. Like we'll break down how many there are, what are the ones that are important, what are the ones that are most influential. And by doing that, it kind of tip us off to maybe what scares us and what's, if you're a person who loves watching horror movies, it'll help you guide you for what you're into. And then if you're a person who's into making horror movies, it'll maybe give you an idea of what kind of like load-bearing walls to build your ideas on. So all that being said, I've had some people ask for longer episodes, so that's what this one is. If you're not a person who's into all this rambling, I'll put the little scrolly bar thing, I'll put the chapters in there, and you can kind of go through and find what you need to watch and what you don't need to watch. Otherwise, buckle up. Um, Before we begin, a little bit of housekeeping. Counting Sheeple. They're currently on tour in New Zealand. They're not here today. They'll be back next week. They're huge down there. People love them. Hot Take Bot. No Hot Take Bot today. He took his kids to Disney World, and I was like, well, dude, didn't you just put them back in school? And he said yes, but he wanted them to see Disney World before the Great Awakening. And I didn't know what that meant, and I got scared, so I cut off the conversation. So barring Homeland Security stepping in, he should be back next week. Let's see. Pierre. Pierre is visiting his father. However, he's going to do his production stuff, his producing duties via Skype. So, Pierre, can you hear me?
Nope.
Okay, then. Looks like it's just me and you, Floppy. You're the worst character yet.
Thanks.
Great. Well, anyways, let's get started. Horror. What's not to love about horror? Am I right? It's one of those things where when you try to explain to people what you love about horror, they don't really get it. And then the people who already get it don't need any explanation, So I don't really know why I'm going to ramble about this since I've just explained why it's futile, but let's go forward, shall we? From the early days when I started watching movies, I remember always having a fond affection for horror. Ever since I was young, I've always been mildly fascinated by magic. Not magic like performance magic, because I find magicians to be kind of creepy and weird. They got to keep kayfabe. So for you to believe that they're connected to some sort of magical world, they have to be sort of weird and spooky. All that turned me off as a kid. But I always liked to know what the magic tricks were, because they're tricks. It's a combination of applied science and like hustle, or like con games. So I always thought maybe if I knew the tricks people could pull on me, I would be more inoculated against them. So I love to learn the ways people fool each other. And that's where I'm pretty much getting at with horror movies is I'm about to say something real cornball here. So, just batten down the hatches and hold on to your butts. We'll get through this together. But movies are magic, y'all. I said it. There it is. I'm the first person to ever have that thought. There you go. No, not so much that the traditional way that everybody says movies are magic, where it's like 24 frames of still footage becomes a moving 1 second, and that 1 second gets strung together with a bunch of other seconds and makes a movie. Or the idea that you can film someone in LA and film someone in New York, and you can put the two scenes together and you can make a scene, and those people have never even met. So not that magic. I'm talking about magic, like all the tricks of cut this together with that to fool your brain into thinking something happened that it didn't, So if you look at magic, like there's the Mount Rushmore of magic tricks, right? You take the rings and they're locked together and then they're not. Ta-da! And then day two, it's like, okay, well, is this your card? And it is your card. It's amazing how they do that. And then day three, it's like, rabbit. Wow. And then after you've knocked out all those low-level tricks, it's like, I don't know. I guess we're just only thing left to do is saw a pretty woman in half, right? And that gets us back to horror. When you tell people you like horror, there's an instant assumption that you're, a masochist or a misogynist or some other real powerful word on the Scrabble board, right? But it's usually just the opposite. The reason they have the pretty woman both being sawed in half and in the horror movie is because I'm worried about her. You know what I mean? If it's some dude, it's like, take care of yourself. You're expected to. It's one of the only movies where women get to be the lead and they get to be like smart and resourceful and win in the end. Horror movies and romantic comedies are like the primary roles for women to get leading. Anyways, so when you watch the woman get sawed in half, it tells you a lot about our society, just like the horror movies do. We don't worry about what happens to old people. It's like, yeah, they've had a chance to live and make their mistakes. Not a lot of old horror movies take place in nursing homes. And I swear to God, don't write Bubba Hotep in the comments or I'm going to drop a Macho Man elbow on you. But our society also values attractiveness versus being unattractive. They value youth over, being old. They value women over men. Men are disposable. You can find a million sperm anywhere, but that one egg, that's precious. So women in general are just more valuable than men. So people have this weird misassumption where they assume that if you're watching some woman run for her life that you're happy. It's like, no, I'm worried about her. That's what makes you care. Another important factor of horror movies and the reason they're important in like movie history is because it's often a way for low budget movies to get made, which means real creative people can sneak in that back door of horror movies. Normally you got to be somebody's son or somebody's nephew to write a movie or get a movie made, or you have to have a friend of a friend who used to know a guy who's got $1 million he's looking to launder because it's probably illegal money. And the movie hustle game is a real mess. But horror movies are always real low budget and cheap, almost always. So because of the low budget aspect of it, people get a chance, and the creativity involved in it is very important. So a lot of the big time directors like, James Cameron, Sam Raimi, Peter Jackson, Guillermo del Toro, a lot of our biggest, Catherine Bigelow, a lot of our like biggest, most important filmmakers start out in horror because that's pretty much anybody can get a chance there, and a lot of people crash and burn. That's why there's so many terrible horror movies. But then every now and then somebody succeeds so well that it just knocks it out of the park, and then that becomes a franchise, or that director gets made. That's where Wes Craven came from. Another great thing about horror is that it's, along with sci-fi and fantasy, are really the only genres that allow for bad movies. Like, if you make a bad comedy, it sucks. No one wants to watch that. It's going to die a lonely death. If you make like a bad drama and it's heavy-handed and people are just like, this is like a terrible soap opera, same deal. It's just going to go away. But if you make a bad horror movie, people will watch it and enjoy it forever. They'll enjoy the badness of it, the schlockiness of it. Same with sci-fi and fantasy. There's people like to see how someone's creativity was a bit sloppy or suspect. So in those instances, like the horror movies kind of end up living forever. The bad ones are just as important as the good ones sometimes. History. Okay, I think that's a good place to lead us into the history of horror movies and how they evolved. Modern filmmaking begins right around the 1900s. The camera was invented in the late 1800s, and it takes them a while to figure out how to do what they're doing. So, right around 1900 is when things get going. And from jump, horror is one of the first things that grabs people. Nosferatu in particular, that was one of the ones that figured out that practical effects look so good in film. Like, if you put on a scary mask and someone sees it, they're like, wow, that's really scary and creepy. But they can see the seams in the neck, or they can see when you turn, oh, that's not quite right. But if it's on film, you can cut around that. You can shoot in the shadows. You can do this or that. So, practical effects, makeup and stuff like that just looks so much better on film than it does on stage because you can work around it. Also, things that we sort of learned early on were like, perspective and forced perspective, oddball angles. A Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is a classic for that. It's got lots of weird sort of disorienting angles of the camera, and in general, it's just sort of a bizarro trip out movie, and it ends up being copied a million times over. Also, another one that's early on, it's more towards the late, like 1920s, but it's still in the silent era, is Vampire or Vampire. I don't know how you pronounce it. It's Vampire with a Y. Last time I saw it was on HBO Max, so it floats around. And it's like a classic in horror. It feels almost like a Paranormal Activity movie. It's way ahead of its time, even though it's a silent film. You just feel like you're in that house where it's taking place, and the walls feel alive, you know. So when we move past kind of the silent era, where, you know, just the imagery of the fact that we're making things move is enough to blow people's minds, you know, once you start getting towards talkies, now you got to put a little more effort into what you're doing, right? So the early talkie horror movies are pretty much dominated by the Universal monsters. You know, there's a lot of other horror movies in there. White Zombie with Bela Lugosi's in there, which is one of the first early zombie movies and stuff. But those Universal monsters, in particularly from like 1931 to 1941, the Universal monster craze ran from 31 to 51, but the back half is mostly like Creature from the Black Lagoon and sequels to those original 10, and then like the Abbott and Costello meets, you know. So the first original 10 years of those Universal monsters, that's where you get your Dracula, Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, Wolfman, you know, the Mummy, I think, is in there. So that's where all that comes from. And they, you know, dominate that era. And then moving into the 40s, out of the 40s and into the 50s, you know, they're run into that problem of what do we do with these horror movies once they're not scary? Like once people have seen the magic trick, it's not impressive anymore, so now it's not scary. And that's where Abbott and Costello come in. They turn the horror into comedy. You know, I think it was after Jaws 2, they were going to make Jaws 3 be a comedy. Because that's just the natural place to go. After you've exhausted the scariness of what you're doing, the natural evolution ends up being, you know, just make fun of yourself. Really, Freddy Krueger's a classic example. Like the first movie's terrifying and scary, but then by the time you're to the third and fourth, Freddy Krueger's like almost Bugs Bunny, you know. Starting in the 50s and 60s, people start being aware of how traumatized they were by the bombs being dropped in World War II, right? So the Japanese response is to make like kaiju movies, Godzilla, you know, this radioactive dragon that rose up out of the water. But in America, you get a lot of like Attack of the 50-Foot Man and, you know, shrinking people, and you get Them, which is about like giant ants and stuff like that. So there's a lot of fear of science going on in the 50s in particular. You know, it's nothing original. Frankenstein is fear of science. You know, once human beings saw that some people who mess with science will try to play God, there's always that distrust of science and medicine and, you know, all that. So especially by highly religious and superstitious people, they're going to be way freaked out by, you know, what are trying to bring people back to life and stuff. You know, it's an abomination against God and all this. Also in the 50s, you get a lot of just figuring out what's the difference between thriller and horror. Like how much drama needs to dominate the plot before it's considered a thriller. You know, otherwise is, you know, if you put Vincent Price in an old creepy house, is it just automatically horror? You know, so they're trying to unravel the Christmas lights of what exactly is horror, thriller, you know, scary matter that's like dark but scary subject matter that's fun. You know, they're just trying to make sense of everything because movies have been only around for like 20, 30 years. I mean, talkies, you know, have only been around for like 20, 30 years. So they're, you know, learning the language of film at this point. Moving into the 60s, you start to get like Hammer horror. That's where the people in Britain, there's this company called Hammer, and they remade all the old Universal monsters, you know, Frankenstein and Dracula and the Wolfman and all that. And they dig deep into you know, they kind of reinvent those characters. And the big thing they do is they throw actors at it. Like Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff and Lon Chaney Jr., they're all great, right? But they're nothing compared to like Peter Cushing and, you know, the actors that they get from England and Britain. That's where Shakespeare comes from. It's the original, you know, dramatic actors come from there. So they've been doing this longer than anybody. Nobody acts better than the Brits. So when you get a cast full of, you know, stiff upper the British people acting very, you know, erudite, and they're going about their business, and how dare you? the movie's much more entrancing, you know, as where in American people, it's like, oh, yeah, see, the real colloquial kind of 1940s noir crap. But, by those time they get those 60s Hammer horror movies, those are great. They feel like Shakespearean plays, right? And then in the late 60s and the early 70s, now movies have been out long enough, plus television has been invented, and you get like all those movies like the old Universal horror is now on late night TV. And in the late 60s and early 70s, you get the first generation of filmmakers born where movies that existed their whole lives and have been everywhere. Like if you start making movies in the 40s, you're one of the early creators of film. People haven't figured out stuff yet. But by the time the 60s and 70s come, you get Brian De Palma, Scorsese, Spielberg, George Lucas, all these people who have figured out what works and what doesn't, and they've developed a style by, I like that, I don't like that, that really works well for that, that doesn't work well for that. And they understand the language of film from the start instead of trying to, they're not making the map as they go along, they're reading the map, right? So in that 70s and late 60s, they infuse what was in the horror, the Hammer horror stuff. You put in a lot of drama, right? So you needed to make it more interesting to the viewer by having a little bit of story before the horror comes in. So a lot of the stuff in the late 60s and the 70s is about people. The Exorcist is about people. Even though it's about demons and exorcisms in the Catholic Church and stuff, it's more about a mother and her daughter. The Omen is about a concerned father, and a mother losing her mind. A movie like Rosemary's Baby, it's taking concern for what women think, the fears they have when they're pregnant and what, the paranoia they have around them and stuff, right? So in this late 60s and early 70s horror revival, reshaping, whatever, I feel like Stephen King is a huge influence because Stephen King's novels and then the movies that are later adapted from his novels all have this real important cog in them where we learn about the characters first. We spend time with the people. We learn their stories. This person's family's died, and when they went to the funeral, a bunch of other people committed suicide. It's like, oh man, they're in the middle of a tragedy. So now when a stabber shows up, it's like, they've been through too much already. So to get the audience invested in the characters that you're supposed to care about, there needs to be some build-up, right? And that's really good in the 60s and the 70s. That's the characters in the horror movies. This is the ultimate like drama and story that has been built up, upon the shoulders of the Hammer horror movies as well as the Universal monsters and even those Vincent Price stuff in the middle. Also in the middle there, in the 60s, Roger Corman did some Edgar Allan Poe movies, which they have the same kind of Gothic tone that the Universal monsters have, like big castles and shadowy hallways and, people walking in the dark with a candle and all that, So those were huge influences on the people that came into the 70s. Okay, so then the 1980s comes along. And what happens in the 1980s? Everybody thinks slasher movies happens, which they do because in the late 70s, John Carpenter makes late 70s, mid to late 70s. John Carpenter makes Halloween, right? And that becomes the highest grossing independent movie of all time. So since it's made independently, the profit margin on it is humongous. So people see how much money can be made from a good horror movie. So, before these guys in the 50s, William Castle and them, they made their horror movies, but they were intended to be schlocky and just, turn a buck, Roger Corman style. This is now, we're going to make a movie that's going to be in the theater for 2 years, Jaws also comes along at the same time, and it's the same deal, let's just tell a story about a scary fish and traumatize children forever, and it'll be a blockbuster and reshape the way movies are made, Also, I kind of glossed over 60s there, Psycho pops up. And that, along with Michael Powell's Peeping Tom, are like the two first slasher movies, so to speak. They heavily influence what goes on then into the 70s, with Bob Clark's Black Christmas, and then Wes Craven doing Last House on the Left, and then Carpenter doing The Babysitter Murders, which was ended up being Halloween. I think it was The Babysitter Murders. Yeah, whatever. So the evolution of can't have anything in any like blood and gore and sex in your movies like in the 30s and the 40s, to pushing the boundaries of how scary can we make this. And then eventually by the 60s and the 70s, now we're seeing people be stabbed and we're seeing blood and we're, getting a little more nudity and things that are more salacious that'll push the boundaries to get people to come look at it. It's like, oh, what are you doing that's different? Oh, you got nudity? Okay, let me look, So that's part of it. But then in the 1980s, with that slasher movie, slashers being a bona fide way to make a lot of money, two big things happen. VCRs come out and cable television happens. So now, even though there's been, 70 years of movies being made, there's a huge demand for color, talky, up-to-date, modern product. You know what I mean? So all the stuff made before the 60s and all that don't have any nudity or blood or stabbing or something. And because a lot of it's in black and white and a lot of it's not, just scary by today's standards, it falls to the wayside. It becomes a classic. So modern, updated horror just needs to be made because we need to put it on the video store shelves. We need to get it on Cinemax and all that. So there is just an abundance of Halloween ripoffs. The most famous is these dudes were like, what's a scary holiday besides Halloween? And they're like, Friday the 13th? And they're like, yeah, somebody has to own that already. So they put out an ad in newspapers that said Friday the 13th, like an ultimate experience in terror or whatever. And then they wanted to see, will anybody sue us? And when nobody sued them, they instead had a bunch of phone calls of people who were like, we want that Friday the 13th movie. So they ended up making that movie that was nothing more than just a test balloon to see if they were going to get sued or not. And then, now here we are with Jason, sorry. So all throughout the 80s is really heavily dominated by the slashers because it's so much easier to make that cheap, people in the woods, you usually don't have to pay for permits and stuff. You can have your friends make it. The people are willing to take a lot of risks. You can treat your actors like crap. But if you want to make something like The Exorcist, you got to have big money and great actors and, to have a set that you can turn into like a refrigerator and all that. You can't do that on a low budget. But Evil Dead, it's like, let's go out to a cabin and torture you guys for 3 weeks and then whatever turns out, turns out. And then, of course, we go through that whole big, mostly slashers in the 80s. And then into the 90s, we move into what I call post-horror. Now, a lot of other people call this post-horror primarily because of Wes Craven's Scream. And that's, a movie where the people in the movie know that horror movies exist. And they know that you watch horror movies and think, oh, that girl's stupid. Who would go in the garage right now? And, the movie itself understands that the audience knows what to expect and it tries to subvert it or it plays into it or it does like a meta-analysis of it or whatever. So Scream is really important for that, and we get a lot of that, moving past. But the other thing I think it does as far as post-horror is we now understand when to infuse horror. Like, to class up the horror in the 70s, they add a bunch of drama to it. So it's like, oh, this isn't a horror. Look at these great actors we have and how much money we're doing and all this, advertising and everything. This is a big deal movie. This isn't a schlocky horror. But by the time they get to the 90s, it's the other way around. They go to make thrillers, but they know something scary is to happen in the thriller, like police procedurals and stuff. If you're a cop and you go to a murder scene and you see some dude stabbed to death, bleeding on the ground, and his wife's in the kitchen crying and their kids in the bedroom freaking out, that's a horror scene. You are traumatized. You will have post-traumatic stress disorder from that probably. So shoot that like a horror movie. Shoot it in the shadows. Shoot it gross, make the blood extra yucky, By the way, and if you live anywhere with wallpaper, you are way more likely to be murdered than anywhere else. So don't put wallpaper up. It's a sure tip-off. So the 90s sort of shape that horror can be used as like a tonal change, the way you have like a rap interlude and a pop song. It's like, here's 3 regular verses and then the rap verse. That's how you do with horror. It's like, we'll take a regular movie that's serious, like Silence of the Lambs, and when it's time for horror, it'll be horrible. Or Seven, that's one of my favorite ones. It's just a police procedural, and most of it's real like emo and sad, and everybody's kind of crying, and it's raining all the time. But when it's horrible, it's horrible. It'll give you nightmares. And then moving into the thousands, this terrible thing happens. Prior to that, you had to use your imagination and be creative. If you wanted a monster, you had to figure out, are we going to, claymation the monster, or are we going to make somebody be in a suit, or are we going to use special effects and use like practical, like a cardboard cutout and shine a shadow on it and just have people react? There's all these ways to get what you need done. But the thousands, CGI comes along, and anything you can imagine can happen. Now it's just call up somebody and order 5 monsters, no problem. Make 2 of them slutty just for fun, you know? So when you can do anything, suddenly this dearth of creativity just happens. Everything gets swallowed up into a black hole. It's like if you tell somebody, name anything in the world, they'll go, lantern. Because your brain draws a blank proposed with the idea of anything possible, right? And that's what's happened with CGI. When you can do anything your brain can come up with, your brain just sort of farts away and you don't have any more good ideas. So through the thousands, we get more zombies, we get more Draculas, we get more werewolves occasionally. A few original ones pop up here and there, but it's a whole bunch of just stuff we've seen before, done now better with more money, better cameras, and CGI. So it's a whole lot of member-berry retreads. All right, so let's move on to the horror genres. Okay, one of the wonderful things about horror is that it falls into many categories. And that's one of the things I like about it. Like, if you don't like those stabby slasher movies from the 80s, which I don't, I find them to be real derivative. Like, the ones that are good, like the first Nightmare on Elm Street, or I like Friday the 13th 4, I don't know, and 6. Most people like 2 and, I don't know, Jason Goes to Space, or whatever the hell it is, Jason X. But when you make a good slasher movie, you feel for the characters, and it's, that's why I say Nightmare on Elm Street 1 is a classic, because that's Nancy's movie. It's not Freddy's movie. We're concerned about Nancy. We see her start off as like a happy, bright-eyed, dipshit, and then later on she's got like the gray streak in her hair, and she's just pounding coffee, and as the movie goes on, she changes who she is. There's a character arc there. Most of the other movies, they just don't have that. Okay. One of the great things about horror movies is that it's a huge tent. Like there's a lot going on in this, carnival. So, there's the slasher movies of the 80s, like I mentioned. But if that's not what you're into, because it just kind of grows cheap, the classic sawing the woman in half. How'd they do that? If you're not into that, you can be into, woman moves into old haunted house. Family goes on vacation in the middle of nowhere. What's another one? People on a road trip go over a hill and there's a giant monster there waiting for them. There's a lot to choose from under there. So because of that, that's one of the reasons horror is so great. You're not boxed into just like pretty much all romantic comedies are romantic comedies. Pretty much all action movies are action movies. The horror movies, there's a wide variety. It and science fiction, those are the two best for that. So I thought I would look up, what did other people on the internet think were these horror subgenres? And I found anywhere between 4 or 5 to 270. Now, the person who came up with 270 subgenres, they need a hug. They need to get off the internet. They need to knock that off. But the people who found 4 or 5, I actually outdid them. I found 3. You can boil it down to 3 main subgenres. So, in my opinion, the 3 fears that motivate horror movies are fear of death, which is, most all movies have that, action movies, etc. But, no matter how rich you are, you can't spend it if you're dead. So what's important is that, you stay alive and the people you love stay alive. So fear of death or fear of loss is always like the primary motivator of your horror movie. Secondly, there's a fear that I don't think people talk about in horror movies, but the fear of assimilation. All right. I think it's really most scariest in the alien movies, when basically people are impregnated against their will by a face-humping monster. But this assimilation thing runs all throughout horror. If a vampire bites you, what happens? Well, you die or become a vampire. Well, what happens if a werewolf bites you? Well, you die or you become a werewolf. But what about a zombie? What happens if I fall asleep next to a pod? So the fear of loss of self and the loss of your own identity, I don't know if that's more stemmed in like human beings' natural sense of tribalism and fear of someone coming and taking over your tribe and making you into them, or if it's more of like fear of loss of your own logic, like people are afraid of mental deterioration and whatnot. So just you no longer being who you recognize is terrifying. The Exorcist is an assimilation movie. What happens to Reagan after the demon takes over? We don't know. She's just off on the sideline waiting to get back in the game. So there's the fear of death or fear of loss, other people dying. There's fear of being assimilated into something you don't want to be. And then lastly, there's the fear of the unknown. All right. And that's pretty much the three basic things all people are afraid of. The reason religion works so well on people is because we don't know what happens when you die. The reason people are so susceptible to, voodoo and ideas of like somebody putting a curse on people and stuff is because mystical things that are beyond our understanding are extra creepy, because I don't know anything about voodoo. So if somebody says that's what's going on, that's what's going on, So you can make a good voodoo horror movie because by nature the audience is just, I don't know what they're talking about. Weird. Also, like fear of the unknown can be anywhere as simple as just like the lights go out and you're in the dark and you can't see in front of your face anymore, so you're afraid. It's the fear of the unknown. But then there's also like fear of what's out there in those woods. What are those people in that town that I never go to doing? All these things, just the stuff you don't know and is new to you makes you uncomfortable because you're, in the dark. No one likes to be stupid. So ultimately trying to dig through these genres and subgenres and figure out what are the ones I would really consider. I found 8 that kept popping up on all the lists. And then I found another 7 that were on most of them. So we got like a 15 list of subgenre here. But like I say, most of them in general are pretty much, predictable, and a lot of them are doubled up. So we'll go through that here. To begin with, the main one they consider is the slasher movie. I think that's what most people think of when they think of horror, right? When you're like, oh, I watch horror movies. It's like, oh, some big brute stabbing some small woman. And it's like, no, it's more than that, whatever. So the slasher itself is kind of fascinating to me. It's the boogeyman of a situation, right? So like Jason is the boogeyman of the woods. If you've ever been out in the woods, you have that fear of the unknown because you're used to the city and the conveniences of indoor plumbing and all that. But now you're out of your element and you don't know anybody around you because there is nobody around you. You're off isolated. So if somebody came and attacked you, you're all on your own. And that's like why people tell ghost stories sitting around campfires or whatever. You're isolated from everyone. So the fear that someone could attack us is very genuine. But the idea that in these woods particular, someone can attack us because I don't know which way to run. I'm not good at running in the woods. I don't know how to survive out here. All that, right? So Jason Voorhees kind of carves out the niche of like the boogeyman of the woods. We all sort of have that fear, unless you're, one of those people who loves the woods and hates the city. But even then, you got your boogeyman too, because the boogeyman of the suburbs is Michael Myers, right? When you hear a noise in the middle of the night when you're in bed and you like kind of look down the hallway, or like sometimes you'll be in bed and you'll hear like a creak in the kitchen and you're like, oh shit. Like that's what Michael Myers provides. He provides that fear of, you're not safe. Even though you've ran and hid from the city, or you're safe away from the perils of the nature and the country, no matter where you try to be safe, you're not. And that's what Michael Myers is. It's like that creak in the floorboard, the settling of some chair in a guest room. It's like, oh shit, Michael Myers. And then like Freddy is the fear of your dreams. We've all had nightmares. We've all been terrified by them. We've woken up bothered and disturbed for the next day. That's where Freddy lives. He taps on that. Freddy can't get you if you're awake, So each one of these boogeymen carves out their own lane. Jaws is the most effective boogeyman ever, People were terrified of the water thanks to Jaws, I think Hellraiser, although most people think that that's like a religious kind of biblical thing, I think The Exorcist kind of carves that lane out more. I feel Hellraiser sort of carves out people's fear of S&M. It's all about leather and spikes and bleeding and weird sex behavior and stuff. Like I think that creeps a lot of folks out who don't know anything about that because they just assume, oh, so-and-so's, got a leather gimp at home or whatever. And that's what Hellraiser digs into and taps into. So these slasher movies, they each carve out their own lane of what specific boogeyman they are. So that's why I think they're important. And I understand that's why that always gets bumped to the front of the line when people think of the subgenres of horror. Let's see here. The second one everybody seems to think is popular is the monster. And I think we can agree with that because even the slashers are technically monsters. Jason Voorhees is pretty much the Mummy or Frankenstein. It's an unstoppable beast and it's stumbling along. Frankenstein's a little more sympathetic than Jason Voorhees, but you get the idea. Not to mention these human-sized monsters, but also big monsters. Sasquatch is a monster, or Troll from Troll Hunter, or those weird monsters that live in the cave in The Descent. Krampus, monsters. They just exist. It's the fear of the unknown, things that exist beyond what we understand. That's why I think Sasquatch as a concept exists, is people don't believe that we've found all that there is to find. So, Sasquatch as a monster or the abominable snowman as a monster is just sort of important because it leaves hope for more. Third is paranormal. I could see that, that's anything to do with ghosts or things that's, once again, the fear of the unknown. People don't understand what happens when they die, and people like to imagine that there's more going on in their home. That noise clearly wasn't just a floorboard settling. That has to be the person who lived here before me walking around, So paranormal and fear of not understanding everything in our universe on a tertiary, tangible level, that's understandable. So, your ghosts, your haunted houses, Amityville Horror, Paranormal Activity, etc. 4 is psychological horror. I think that really taps into what most people of us understand, is that we're nothing but, a flesh robot being operated by a meat computer. And if your meat computer starts damaging itself and isn't working right, the things around you can become scary. People who are allies will suddenly seem like enemies. A shadow will scare you enough where you're hiding and, you won't come out of your house. So we know that our brain is real key to interpreting everything. And if your brain starts working against you, you're screwed. 5 is a double, both body horror and gore horror. I feel like they're the same thing. Gore horror, I think, gets associated more with like slashers and stabbers and, Texas Chainsaw Massacre and whatever. I think that people associate that more with gore. But I also sort of lump gore in with body horror, which is more like, David Cronenberg type deal, right? It's the weird pus that you get on the boil in your face, or the time your finger got infected and there was that yellow ooze that stunk, and just grossness. You get the toenails and all, just the human body is a gross mess. That's not even getting into our genitalia and all our buttholes and all that. You know what I mean? So just human beings are gross and dealing with grossness. It's funny to me that even needles kind of go into the gore body horror sort of thing because people don't want to see that, and anything to do with eyeballs. Oof, always with the gore and the body horror. 6 I'm pissed about is found footage. I don't know if found footage to me is a way to convey a story. It's not a particular horror element. To me, you can tell any story in found footage. I'm still waiting for someone to make a good action movie where it's like, oh, this person went on this adventure and we found this, thing and we've cut it together and look what they did to save the world, But instead, somehow, because it's such a cheap way to make a movie, it ends up in that low budget, back door that the filmmakers use to get in, because of horror. As far as found footage goes, a lot of people just immediately like, oh, Blair Witch. But before Blair Witch, there were 2 other biggies. The one most people know is Cannibal Holocaust, which is one in the 70s about some idealistic hippies who go out on like a Peace Corps mission and then, get murdered by cannibals, and they find the camera and the film that they were making a documentary about later. So, Blair Witch did nothing new. It had been done, 15 years earlier. Also, there's a real good one called Last Broadcast that came out like a year before Blair Witch. It takes itself real serious. It's great. I dig that one up and find it. I recommend it. But yeah, I wouldn't say found footage exists solely for horror, but apparently other people do. And then 7 is comedic horror, or horror comedy. And I think, like I said, getting back to the Abbott and Costello, once you start to run out of ideas of being genuinely scary, you kind of have to take yourself not serious, because it's easier to make fun of yourself than it is to be deathly serious. It's easier to make funny Batman than it is to make serious Batman. That's from all along, the evolution of we'll just make fun of this always happens. So comedy horror is a real touchy subject with me. Sometimes it's great, like Tucker and Dale versus Evil is fantastic, and the Sam Raimi Evil Dead movies and the Ash versus the Evil Dead, all that's just fantastic. I love it, great. Leslie Vernon or whatever, Rise and Fall of something like that. Look that one up, the Leslie Vernon one. That one's great. In the Abbott and Costello ones are really funny and good stuff. Ghostbusters. What's the ones with the little kids? Monster Squad. That's what it is. Sheesh. There's just endless good horror comedy where it balances out what you thought was scary and troubling, and then it gives you a little bit of a laugh, like the same way going over the roller coaster hill, you go, oh my God, I almost died. Ha 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 ha. So good horror comedy will provide that for you. It'll give the tension and the release you're looking for. Okay, and then these last 8, like I said, these were ones that just kept showing up on lists, but I didn't think they were as important. But folk horror. I've never really heard of this genre, but as I read about it, it made more sense. It's basically the fear of the other kind of thing. Deliverance is some good folk horror, but the one that the most examples used was Midsummer. You go somewhere different, like Wicker Man. You go to a place where society's different and where the people are different, and those people in that town are kind of off or whatever. You ever been on a road trip and you stop and you get gas and you kind of get out and stretch your legs and you look around and you're like, these people are weird. Meanwhile, those some people do that to your town. You know what I mean? Everybody thinks the other people are strange. So, the idea that the people in an area are different from you and their customs are so different from you that you're, could be in trouble. I suppose even hostile to a certain extent would fall into folk horror. Gothic horror, that takes us back to, Vincent Price in the old houses, Bela Lugosi coming down the steps and Dracula. Just the idea. Most Gothic horror is defined by old castles and all these ideas of like shadows and the other romantic, otherworldly endeavors and, fall in love with a ghost and stuff. I find Gothic stuff, to me, probably the most recent Gothic stuff would probably be like Interview with a Vampire was really good. Bram Stoker's Dracula, all those. I don't know why I keep coming back to vampires for the Gothic, because I think they sort of dominate that area. Zombies go outside and run around, and werewolves go do stuff in the woods or whatever. It's like, Dracula seems to stay at home in the castle. He likes it there. Natural horror, that's basically fear of nature. The Gray, if you've ever seen that, that's really good. To a certain extent, The Revenant, maybe even. The Revenant's got a lot of stuff going on in it. But The Cave and The Descent, and but really even just I'm trying to think of movies like there's one with Idris Elba and Kate Winslet. It's like a romantic comedy where they're like trying to just get themselves out of a snowy mountain. It's basically that Alive movie about those Brazilian soccer players that ate each other's butts. It's that same damn movie, except it's a romantic comedy. That's what natural horror is. You just Frozen. That's the good example. I couldn't think of a good example. Frozen, not the Disney movie, the people trapped on the ski lift. It's the elements that will get you. As a human being, that's what my problem with humanity is. I don't understand why human beings are so crappy to each other, because we have to look out for nature and for disease. And with nature, like, the world around us, one day the sun is going to swallow our whole world. You know what I mean? Why are we bickering over inches of land? We got bigger fish to fry, So natural horror, I don't consider it as horror like most people do, but, it's definitely got its place. And then teen horror, that falls back into my whole thing about where people value youth over, older people. If you go through and you look at how many damn movies take place in a high school, or how many movies are about teenagers, and that is a big deal because teenagers are susceptible to horror movies more than anybody because they still have a young enough mind where this could be real, or this may creep me out or disturb me for a while. When you're 50, you're like, yeah, it's a movie somebody made. I've seen it. But when you're 12 and you see if you see It Follows when you're 14, you'll probably be disturbed for a while. And that's why teen movies are important. These movies are for them. They should feel like they relate to them. But it also it often ends up as a creepy excuse for perverts to be like, let's put some naked girls in there. And it's like, why are you showing me what's supposed to be a high school naked girl? Like, are the cops here? Get away. Right? So that's one of the reasons I don't like teen horror. Like, a lot of times they mix in sexuality. And when I'm just trying to watch horror, the last thing I want is, it's funny when I used to work in video stores, people would come in all the time and they'd be looking for a horror movie they could watch with their kids. And I'm like, oh, so no violence? And they're like, no, they can have all the violence and blood and terror they want. I just don't need to feel uncomfortable while the people in the movie are giving each other blowjobs and my daughter's sitting next to me, So that's the problem with teen movies, is they have too much just teen stuff in it for grown folks to be watching legitimately. Next is demonic movies. I feel like demonic falls in under Paranormal Activity, but it also falls back under my subheading of just fear of the unknown. Religion terrifies people. Going against the religion and what, don't do anything that could be satanic or sacrilegious or offensive to God, because that's a power beyond your control and you're scared of it. So demonic is that same deal. The idea that demons will possess your soul. Which really I always call these exorcism movies, but there's also demon movies like Night of the Demons, and they're basically glorified zombie movies. Like, a human being will be turned into a demon and the demons go, terrorize the other people. Night of the Demons is probably the best one. I would recommend the old one, not the newer modern remake. Zombie obviously is the fear of assimilation thing we talked about, but it's it's a nephew of Dracula and a nephew of the werewolf and all that. That you're yourself and you have one set of thoughts, but then these horde will come and assimilate you. The Borg from Star Trek. It's just, that's what they do. They make you part of them, the pod people. So zombies are that, but then the other key component to the zombie movie is post-apocalyptic. Like, the more isolated you are, like when you go out to the woods and stuff, you don't have any help. Or if you're out on the ocean, you don't have any help. No one can come save you if you scream as loud as you want. So, and that's the thing with zombies. If everybody in the world's dead and the monsters are trying to get you, you can't just say, help, help, because no one's coming. So yeah, post-apocalyptic, along with, basically zombies are just shark heads on top of dead people. There's, next is Witchcraft. Witchcraft to me is a real weak segment. Like, I did a most popular witch movies, a top 6 witch movie. I'll put that at the end of this in the recommended videos thing at the end. But when I did the witch movies, there aren't a lot of good ones. Like, there's little pockets where witches, where I talked about, where you have a regular movie and then a horror scene shows up. So like the witches in Clash of the Titans are scary, or the movie The Witch, which is The Witch, I think 2018, 17, something like that. The Witch. Watch that one. That's still the best witch movie I've ever seen. Otherwise, like, Season of the Witch, which is a George Romero movie, that's just like a metaphor for bored housewives. And like, witch is sort of a cute term to refer to like women. Movies like Practical Magic and Witches of Eastwick. These are all movies talking about like feminist empowerment, especially later in age. The Craft is earlier in age, the teenage version of Practical Magic. What's that one? The Coven, I think. It's just a dude ripoff of The Craft, I think. Whatever. So yeah, Witchcraft movies incredibly disappointing. I feel like you can get some good stuff in there, but people still haven't tapped into the proper witch movie. The best they can do is Hocus Pocus. And then lastly, vampire. Vampire, it's combination of Gothic, combination of natural or zombie, etc. I think the big thing about vampire movies in general is they have a real seductive quality. The vampire, come with me away from the, boring regular world, live this otherworldly life where you never die. There's a desire for people to be rough with you. It taps into a lot of people's like sexual psyche, which, in particularly, because horror movies are really a lot of times geared towards women. They're the biggest audience. It's, some handsome dude who's going to come and bite your neck might be something you're into. I don't know. So vampires are real cyclical though. Like vampires will get big for like a month and then they'll go away for 3 years. You'll get Vampire Diaries and Twilight and all that, but then they'll just stop making vampire movies. Where'd y'all go? But ultimately, when we wrap all this up, I think when we step back, the thing that I love most about horror is when I watch the news, I see real people suffering real things. And it's important to be informed, but to like watch other people's tragedy and not let it affect you is really hard. But watching someone pretending to have tragedy and knowing that the girl running through the woods in the tube top, as soon as she was done with this scene, she got to go to a tent and drink some hot chocolate. And then, 3 months from now, everybody's going to tell her how brave she was for what a good job she did. But, the lady on the news who's holding her dead baby crying or whatever, no, not a lot of sympathy for her. She gets her 15 minutes of fame and moves on, and no one ever checks in on her again. So I just ultimately take comfort in horror movies because I prefer my violence fake. All right, and with that in mind, you enjoy your Halloween, you enjoy your horror movies, and I'll catch you later.